So today we are going to go through the split between state and federal court and also the difference between criminal and civil law. As with most stuff this semester, it should seem vaguely familiar. This right here should seem very familiar, as this is basically the natural extension of federalism. So the big split we're going to see here is who covers what. We talked a little bit about jurisdiction last time. This goes into more detail. So we'll start with federal courts. Hopefully the one in the top left-hand corner looks familiar, as it is right downtown. So first off, interstate international commerce. The second it crosses a border, you guys know this, it falls under the jurisdiction of the federal government. In order to make sure that things are treated fairly and no state has a specific advantage, it falls to the federal court. We will also look at a specific federal court that deals with this in the coming lectures. Next up, federal programs and taxes. Are you suing the Social Security Administration? Do you think you got screwed over on your taxes? In the case of taxes, there's a specific court for it. The rest of it will go through federal court. Because the federal government administers these programs, they're the ones that have jurisdiction over said programs. Otherwise, it would be an absolute nightmare. So rather than let each state sort of interpret how they want to do it, it is up to the feds to prosecute these cases or to defend themselves in cases where a citizen is going to sue the federal government for either not doing something or for doing something incorrectly. Treaties and foreign nationals come next. If you are suing the U.S. government for entering into, an agreement with North Korea to sell them bagels, and you think that we shouldn't be sending North Korea bagels because they're all awful people and, war criminals and all that sort of stuff, then you would sue the federal government to stop them from doing that. Good luck with that lawsuit. More realistically, though, this is the foreign nationals thing. As we talked about last time with jurisdiction, if somebody's from another country, you don't want to cause an international incident, so the best way to deal with this is send it through the federal system, and they will deal with it. Normally what will happen is, unless this is some major thing, these people are going to probably cut a deal with the State Department and be booted out of the country rather than serve time here. If it's something major, we're talking massive drug smuggling, murder, violent or massive crime, then the feds are going to take over. So in this case, think of something like us extraditing El Chapo from Mexico because it was very clear that Mexico could not hold on to him after, he escaped through a toilet and onto a motorcycle tunnel under the prison that nobody knew about. So rather send him here, we'll prosecute him for crimes in the U.S. instead, federally, despite the fact that he'd committed crimes in multiple states by arranging for the murder of people in New Mexico, Texas, California, New York. Instead, we're just going to prosecute him federally. Patents and bankruptcy, again, more of a federal issue. Patents because, remember, the Patent Office is the sole discretion of Congress, and bankruptcy just to make everything easier. Banks travel across state lines. They lend money across state lines, ergo, interstate commerce. And then lastly, state disputes. We've talked about this time and time again this year. It's way easier for the feds to deal with this because they do not have a horse in that race. Now, on the other side, we got state courts. State law, obviously, so if it is a law, speed limits, anything that is going to be dealt with at the state level, education, then it's going to fall to the state. They wrote the law. They deal with what happens when that law is broken. And as you can see, this also applies to civil court with divorce and family issues. The feds don't get involved in this. It is each state's decision how they want to deal with this, so each state will deal with it on their own. There is, as we briefly saw last time, and we'll go over in more detail later, a pathway for suits in state court to work their way up to the federal level. It's just rather time consuming. Contracts and personal injury. Again, states are going to have their own rules with this. If the contract deals with traveling across state lines, then you're probably going to get into federal court. But for the most part, your contracts and personal injury suits at work are going to happen in a location in the state. Ergo, it is the state's jurisdiction to deal with it. Workers' comp, exact same thing as personal injury. Nothing more to say there. And then unions and regulations as well. You're not going to have a ton of union lawsuits in state court, most likely. That'll probably be arbitrated by the federal government. but if it's a smaller issue, it could come up in state court. And then in the middle here, we've got what happens when, they both have shared jurisdiction. So that'll be civil rights stuff. The feds will usually come in and take control if asked by the state. States should try to deal with this first or head it off at the pass, but end of the day, it is a federal matter. Environmental issues, for states like us especially, where environmental protection and quality is part of our state constitution, both sides are going to deal with this. But if you break, say, a Montana law and not an EPA law, you'd go to Montana court, whereas if you violate an EPA policy, then the feds are going to take you to court instead. Is it a constitutional question? At that point, it's up to you to really call it, or rather the states. Sometimes you'll see it start in a state court, and the state court will punt to federal court or vice versa. It's usually the second option there is federal courts say, it's not really our issue yet. States, you look at it first. And then class action suits are your last one. And that is simply going to boil down to, a couple years ago, you guys probably remember this around Christmas, one of the big video game online systems, I think it was PlayStation, went down because it had been hacked. And a bunch of people from around the country sued Sony, I guess, and said, hey, we paid for this service. We're being denied it. Figure it out. And so because, again, interstate trade, they're probably, in that case, going to federal court, whereas if it happens in a smaller thing, say a bunch of people all buy something from a store, hundreds of people buy something from a store and it's defective, they might enter into a class action lawsuit to fix it. So those, again, can go both ways. As always, if you've got questions on this, leave them in the comments, and I will do a sort of answer session in the coming days, probably on Wednesday or Thursday, which would be I'm looking across my room at the calendar right now, the 24th-ish. We'll probably answer questions on the first 3 videos. All right, let's keep moving, folks. Next up, we've got civil law. So, you did not break the law in a criminal sense. You did not burn down somebody's house. You didn't stab anybody. But you have usually, like it says right here, violated something between 2 private parties. You've most likely broken a contract. Private individuals can also sue in state court. So this is, and the reason she's up there, this is Judge Judy court. This is, you stole my dog, I want my dog back. And the other person says, well, actually, it's my dog, and you just lived in the house with the dog. It's not really your dog. And then it goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Well, obviously, it's not going to be as goofy as Judge Judy, but that is the very basic level of civil law, is one individual suing another individual. You can also, as an individual, sue the state if you believe something has happened, because it's not very likely that the state burned your house down, but you could still feel wronged by the state, or for that matter, the local government. So these are going to be things involving property. So, like I said, my dog, no, it's my dog, that sort of thing. Injury, were you walking up the stairs to someone's house and they didn't ice it and you fell, or de-ice it, and you fell backwards and, you cracked your head and needed to go to the ER. Well, that's negligence on their part, so you're going to sue them for damages, which is the money that you had to spend going to the hospital, something like that. And then the big one where most of this is going to fall is contract disputes. So you thought you were being guaranteed one thing, they thought another thing, or say another thing. Now you've got to go to court over it. It's not going to be particularly fun. This is sort of the boring one. So the other big issue with civil law that you guys need to understand is the burden of proof. What needs to be done in a civil case to prove your case? And what is required is what is called a preponderance of the evidence, which simply means it is more likely than not that that person did it, that that person knowingly violated a contract, didn't do the repair work to get their stairs fixed, whatever. So think of this as just more likely than not. That's really it. This is not beyond a reasonable doubt. We'll talk about that next. And what you are going to be searching for in a civil case is what are called damages. You're not sending anybody to jail out of a civil case. That's not going to happen. Instead, you are going to get money to compensate the plaintiff for loss. Now, on the other hand, if the plaintiff loses, the person who brought the case, the appellant, could be the one who is charged if the case is viewed as frivolous, which means not worth hearing. Some crazy case. You hear about that stuff online every once in a while. All right, so a couple examples for you. We'll just go through these real quick, and then we'll have like 2 slides left for you today. You've probably heard of the McDonald's coffee case. Now, McDonald's cups all need to have warnings that say caution, contents inside may be hot. Presumably we know this, but in this case, McDonald's was truly negligent. McDonald's had basically superheated their coffee, handed it out a drive-through window to an elderly woman who got 2nd, if not 3rd-degree burns on her legs from the coffee spilling on her. So they end up having to pay $2 million here and have to affix the warning label to their cups from now on. Now, most other companies have those warnings there to avoid having, a similar lawsuit in the future. Now, my personal favorite here, and I don't remember the name, and for this I apologize, but the reason there is a shoe up here is because there was a case where what's the polite way to put this? Well, there's no good way to put it. This guy was a pimp, and he was harassing one of the sex workers who worked for him and her John, saying that they had not paid him the appropriate amount of money. So the John proceeded to beat the pimp about the face and neck with a pair of shoes. Now, the pimp, when he got out of the hospital, sued the John for assault and battery. That didn't go through. It was dismissed in criminal court because the guy was seen as defending himself. So then the pimp went on to sue the shoe manufacturer, Nike, for not explaining that a Nike was a weapon and therefore needed to be labeled as such. The judge threw this case out as well, but it's ludicrous, and that's the sort of weirdness you get out of civil law. Susan Boyle, who you may remember from, probably 8-10 years ago now, of like the British version of The Voice or The X Factor or something, was getting pretty famous, and this woman went around pretending to be Susan Boyle, and Susan Boyle sued her effectively for $4 million in the U.S., basically saying that this woman had taken away business opportunities from her because people were paying to go see knockoff Susan Boyle rather than actual Susan Boyle, who didn't want to leave her house anyway. But there you go. In one case, somebody sued NASA because they had a moon rock in the photo and they claimed fraud that it wasn't a moon rock. People are dumb. Another guy tried to sue McDonald's, this case, for saying that there weren't enough napkins in his bag and he had been wronged. Therefore, he needed $1 million in restitution and damages for not having the appropriate number of napkins in his bag. He didn't win, strangely enough. And then lastly, Walgreens sued Theranos for $140 million and is in the process of winning that case right now, if they have not already won it. As you may recall, Theranos was the company that Elizabeth Holmes, the unblinking lady in the black turtlenecks, created, that ostensibly, did very quick blood work checks. But the problem was it was all fraud. The technology did not work. It was very unsafe. And she had misrepresented and in some cases straight up lied about the capabilities of her company and the output generated by her Theranos blood testing machines. To Walgreens. Walgreens invested a bunch of money in her, and then it turns out, oops, she's a fraud. So Walgreens sued her for all of their money back, plus damages. A number of other companies are doing this right now. You can win money in a civil suit. It doesn't necessarily mean you are going to get that money, because in Elizabeth Holmes' case, she is broke. O.J. Simpson was not convicted in his criminal case for the murder of Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman, but he was convicted in the burden of proof for civil law with a preponderance of the evidence and made to pay restitution to the families of his victims. O.J. Simpson has never paid that back. In fact, while you guys are sitting around home for the next couple weeks, highly recommend going on ESPN and watching O.J. Made in America. It's 8 hours, but hey, you've got the time and it's fantastic. All right, we got one more thing to hit on today, and that is criminal law. So, criminal law is somebody actually broke the law. It was written down either at the local, state, or federal level. You done broke it. now you've got to pay. So, legal matters passed by a legislative body to protect the welfare of society. You break that, you break the law. This we don't talk about a ton. More than 90% of cases are actually going to see the defendant plead guilty. Usually because they'll be offered a plea bargain. So here the prosecutor will offer someone less time or a lower charge in exchange for confessing to the crime. So you don't have to go through the entire rigmarole of a criminal trial where the person knows that they'll be found guilty. So the vast majority of cases are never actually going to go to trial. The person's just going to plead guilty, go directly to jail, and then hopefully get out earlier. A plea bargain. So what's that? I just mentioned it. So this is the agreement to plead guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence. This is not always offered. It is solely the call of the attorney general, or rather the district attorney. So you don't have to be offered a plea bargain. It is up to the state/the federal prosecutor to determine whether or not that's actually going to come out. You can have a trial, but you can also request to just have a judge hear your case. That's called a bench trial. They usually go pretty quick. Not super often, but it is an option. For the most part, though, trials are held in front of a jury of 12. Some states do it a little differently, but for the most part, 12. If it's a really big deal, sometimes you will have basically a backup juror. So in case somebody gets hurt or sick while they're in there, you don't have to restart the entire trial. Instead, you basically bring in your pinch hitter juror who's been there listening the whole time, but wasn't going to be able to vote along with the jury as a 13th member. But now that they're down to 12, shazam, they're now officially on the jury. In this case, in criminal trials, the burden of proof requires that the person be found guilty, quote, beyond a reasonable doubt. Not 100%, but 85 to 90%. So you do not have to be dead to rights positive, but there can't be a reasonable way to say that this person didn't do it. So if it's a bunch of equivocations, so if this, if this, if this, if this, if that, and all of those needed to stack up to show that that person was innocent, then that's not really beyond a reasonable doubt. This is when we talked earlier in the year about my antipathy towards the movie 12 Angry Men. This is exactly what I'm talking about. That movie ignores the beyond a reasonable doubt thing and says that it needs to be 100% certain, which is simply not the case. Next up, what are punishments for criminal convictions? Fines, community service, probation, and then you get to the big ones, which are prison time or possibly the death sentence. Nobody on this slide got the death sentence. Usually what will happen if you get prison time, you're also going to get some form of probation afterwards. If you get community service, you might be fined as well. It really depends on the crime, on the prosecutor, and to a lesser degree, on the judge. The sentencing judge will make the final call on the recommendation. So, what sort of stuff do you go to prison for? If you're Al Capone, you are going to go to prison for tax evasion, not for murdering or for bootlegging or for any of the fancy schmancy high-level stuff. You're going to go because you didn't pay your taxes. As a country, we are pretty strict on enforcing this, whereas other countries like Spain, the first time you evade taxes, they just tell you not to do it again, and you're basically cut loose. Next up, we got Charlie Manson, crazy right here. He is down for murder and conspiracy to commit murder, despite the fact, some of you might be wondering, that he wasn't at any of the crimes. That he incited these people to commit the crimes is enough. Think of it this way. If you are to contract a hitman to go kill somebody, and that hitman is successful, not only will that hitman get charged with murder, you will get charged with murder as well. It's the same thing in Charles Manson, except he wasn't paying them, he was just brainwashing them. Timothy McVeigh, who blew up the federal building in Oklahoma City in 1994, I believe, caught multiple murder charges and domestic terrorism charges as well. He was given the death penalty there. Timothy McVeigh's picture is not on this page, by the way. Martha Stewart, down here, insider trading, which means that somebody gave her a stock tip that had not been revealed because that person worked for the company. Martha Stewart made money off of it, which is illegal, and she was sent to jail for it. She went to what is colloquially referred to as a club fed, a minimum security prison. She was there for a while, came back out, and now she does a TV show with Snoop Dogg. So doesn't end terribly for all these people. Rod Blagojevich, we talked about in current events a couple weeks ago. Rod Blagojevich is the former governor of Illinois. He was brought up on federal corruption charges. This is the guy that attempted to sell over the phone the Senate seat of Barack Obama after Barack Obama was elected president back in 2008. He was just pardoned by President Trump like 3 weeks ago. Ken Lay. Ken Lay got nailed on securities, wire, and accounting fraud. If you've heard of Enron, Ken Lay and a number of other people, another guy by the name of like Jeffrey Skilling, ran a company that dealt with energy futures and investing in that and developing them. But the problem is that they cooked their books like crazy. They lied about how much money they were making and used that to manipulate their stock value, all of which is very illegal. Ken Lay to jail. I believe Jeffrey Skilling died in prison a couple years ago. I might have that backwards, but one of them is dead, one's still in jail. And then lastly, this gentleman down here who looks eerily like the Riddler, which is probably the thing he was going for, is Roger Stone. We actually saw him in that Frontline video we watched the other week. Roger Stone, as I mentioned at the time, is on his way to federal prison for, I believe he was given 23 years. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Not 23 years. That's a different person. He could get probably somewhere, he'll probably get like around 9 or 10 years for witness tampering, obstruction of justice. He lied to federal investigators during the Mueller probe. And also he threatened the judge who was trying his case via Instagram by putting like a crosshairs in a picture of her, which was understandably viewed as a threat by the judge. She did not find it funny. So Stone will likely appeal, and we will talk about appeals and all of that stuff later. Real quick, I want to show you one last thing, and then I will let you go for today. We've talked about this before. We've said it in class. Assault and battery, not the same thing. Assault is an attempt to cause harm, usually the threat to cause harm, where battery is actually the application of force. So if I say, I'm going to throw this ball at your head if you don't pay attention, that could be construed as assault. Whereas if I actually throw the ball at you and make contact, at that point, it's battery. So there's the difference. Then, and I would recommend you guys just kind of take your time and look through this. This over here is a really good flow chart of basically anything that can happen once you are arrested for a crime. Like we said, the vast majority of stuff is going to fall in this area right here. Person's going to plead guilty and be sentenced and maybe just make a plea deal. It's that simple. The rest of it can go on for a long time. But that is it for us today. In your next one of these, we are going to go over federal courts and appointments to them. Thanks for playing along. Keep washing your hands, folks. Adios.